Now this concert, if you don't know what you're about to hear, strap in your seatbelt. I can personally, this is a personal guarantee, okay? When you're on your deathbed, several decades from now, and the great slideshow that is your life is flashing before your eyes, I can personally guarantee this concert is going to be one of the slides. Okay? Now whether that's a good or bad thing, that's between you and yourself and your slideshows. Okay? But Rashaan he's done an excellent job preparing this very difficult music. It's the most accessible atonal music you'll ever imagine or hope to hear within a long range of this building. Okay, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming the inexorable Rashaan Allwood.
I'm sure most of you are wondering what that has to do with birds and wondering how that sounds anything like birds. But I'm hoping that by the end of this concert, I can show you and prove to you that that's actually very, very evocative and a very literal just example of birdsong in music. But before we even get into that, we have to get into who is the crazy dude that wrote this down. So Olivier Messiaen was a French 20th century composer. And I kind of characterize him by these kind of four traits. Firstly, he was a man of extremes. And what I mean by that is his teacher told him, listen to birds, they'll be your greatest teachers. And his teacher told that to all of his students. Messiaen's the only one who spent his whole life becoming an ornithologist and just becoming obsessed with transcribing birdsong. So he always kind of took things to their furthest level. But another really important aspect of Messiaen is the fact that he's a storyteller. Messiaen could never write a piece without having some sort of program, story, or kind of guideline to it. His least successful pieces were ones that were just written without anything, like a sonata or etudes. These were what he considered his least successful music, and his most successful music has always been programmatic with some kind of story. Another heavily important aspect of Messiaen as a man is that he was extremely Catholic. And this plays in as well as to his love of nature, because he heard the sounds of nature as God's most natural music. And we'll get into more of what this means. But really, he was someone who had a deep, deep hold in Catholicism. Actually, unrelated to his parents, it was just something he found on his own. And I think that's why it meant so much to him. Which of course brings us to the last point, which is nature. Messiaen loved birds, and he loved the sounds that he found in nature. If we go to the next slide, actually, we'll be listening today to his catalogue d'oiseaux, and this is a catalogue of bird calls. Basically, over a series of 3 years, he literally went into forests and mountains with a notepad, and he tried to transcribe the actual pitches that birds sang. And this kind of resulted in like a series of pieces of 7 books of music. I'll just be playing the first, so don't worry. And we'll get into really what this music is, how he did it, and the most important, why it's worth listening to. So what are we listening to? We're listening to bird songs. So you heard what I just played, but I'm sure most of you would relate more to Liszt's version of bird songs, which sounds like this. To us seems like it relates more to birdsong. You're probably like, why is he playing that tonight? But if we actually, I want us to listen to some bird songs, and what I think we hear in Liszt is he literally transcribes birds as this. And it's kind of this like mindless, like not really, like birds are just chirping in the background. It's just, and what Liszt is doing is he's capturing the feelings he gets from listening to birds. When he listens to birds and he's in nature, he feels that way. What Messiaen did, which was completely new, is rather than transmitting the feelings of being in the nature, he took the actual sounds of being in nature. So we're going to listen to a little bit of some nature, and what I want you to do is listen to these birds not as mindless chatter, but really listen as if they were speaking a language, and listen to the nuance and the specificity that they sing, and listen to how specific they are in their pitches, in their rhythms, in the accents. So let's just take a second to listen to that. And all the different sounds at once. So you hear it's quite meticulous. It's like it's like it's never just like this for like 2 minutes. It's actually quite far from that. And I think Messiaen was challenged by this, and he was someone who, I think it drove him to this extreme version of himself, an extreme version of his personality, devoting his life to taking these literal sounds and doing his best to bring it to the piano. But what happens is we get this juxtaposition of rules of nature and rules of music. Because in music there are certain sounds that sound harmonious, that sound nice. But what happens is when you take the literal sounds that birds make, the literal pitches, you get sounds that are much more angular. You get lines that don't make sense within the rules of music. But the exciting thing is Messiaen decided, I'm going to take a set of laws that exist outside of music, these laws of nature, and just plant them into this instrument that I have. And so it gives us this really exciting new sound. Rather than hearing it as dissonant or like not matching the rules of music, we hear it as something that these are sounds that we've literally never heard before on an instrument like this. These are completely new sound words that we're getting involved in. So what we also have is his influence. So we heard that these calls were actually quite complex. So Messiaen first took this idea very abstractly, and he started taking these melodic motives and making them very asymmetrical, making them not line up. And we have this short excerpt from a piece he wrote in 1936 that shows him just getting into the birdsong world. So here we hear this kind of very unusual sound, but these are the sounds that are more reflective of what he hears in nature. But it gets so much better, because then what we start to hear is birds' transcription. And we're very, very lucky, because Messiaen, in one of his first orchestral pieces where he was writing to imitate bird songs completely, he actually got the songs from a record. So he got a record of American birds, and he listened to it and transcribed it, which means that we have his orchestral versions and we have the literal birds that he heard. So we can hear a little bit of the Baltimore Oriole and how he puts that in the orchestra. So you hear that he takes the same shape and the same lines and you put it in the and we hear with two other birds, here it's with the piano, the whiprush. And the cardinal. This is quite a longer excerpt. So it's really interesting how he's taking these sounds. And unfortunately, we don't get that effect. We don't get to hear that with all of his pieces because he often actually went out into nature. So we don't have the actual recording for him to work with. But it's cool to hear just like a little bit of how his process works. So next we start to hear something very, very different in his writing, and he hears the natural phrasing in these birds. And so there's a very interesting call, again, very abstract in the line. But what he noticed is that in one of these bird calls, it was always punctuated by two short notes. So it would be going, and there's this natural articulation that happens over and over. So, and he does this passage where it's these two birds singing at once. And I'll play this slow motion so you can kind of hear the different accents, the different natural phrasing in each bird. when that's fast, it sounds like super awesome. Etc. So it's this like kind of crazy, exciting juxtaposition of these two birds, these two phrasings happening simultaneously, which is really exciting. And something else that I find really exciting is the technique he uses for pitches. Because actually in this piece, he doesn't completely write only birds. He also sets the settings that he was around, the mountains that he saw, the oceans. And what he does is like, what does a mountain sound like? You can't really express that. But Messiaen felt, for the flight of birds, he'll also express. So there's one bird that he says flies very kind of chaotically and lots of loops, lots of flips. And he writes that so it sounds like this. These kind of crazy explosions. And I used to find it confusing because I didn't understand why those notes, like why those pitches. And what I discovered actually is that it's the most pitches that a piano can play at one time is 12. And then it starts to repeat. So in this pattern, he does all 12 pitches at once. So what he's doing is he's taking the most extreme form of pitch content. He's taking the most dense harmonic material he can find and combining it into these quick explosive gestures. And it's just his way of being like, I'm amazed. And like that's the most incredible way that he can express his amazement is through this kind of chaos. So now the question is, how do we listen to this music? And how do we play it? And I think I first have to go to how do we play it to understand how we can listen. But the problem is, Messiaen often, what he has to do is he has to quantize this rhythm. And what I mean by that is he has to normalize it. The birds sing with such nuance that he couldn't possibly notate it in its fullest extent every time. But that means that you get these lines, this is the call of the Oriole, and he writes it like this. And for a long time, that's how I was playing it. But then I was like, that sounds nothing like a bird. Like I know, like yeah, he transcribed the pitch, but it still sounds nothing like a bird. So what I did is I went to the source, and this is like a couple calls of an Oriole, and we'll hear some nuances, so if you listen to it for a second. And so what I noticed, I'll let you hear it again once I explain, but what I noticed is that there's a swell in the middle of the call. It always goes like, there's always a swell and a quick fall. So if you listen to it again, we can listen for that kind of swell in rhythm and then a quick fall. And so I interpreted that in the passage by doing that same thing. Instead of going and with the call. Because to get a more natural flow of these birds, but there's like over 20 birds in this. So what I have to do is literally listen to every single bird and hear how they phrase it. Another bird, the wren, it's written like, and I noticed that when the bird does oscillations that are close to each other, they're very fast. When he does oscillations far from each other, they're slower. So even though it's all written at the same tempo and the same notation, I chose to listen to the bird and learn from its rhythm. And I do have context for that because when Messiaen's wife first played this music for him, she said, I played all the right notes and I did everything, and he told me that it wasn't right. He's like, go out and listen to the birds. So she drove out way out in the middle of nowhere in France and listened to these birds, came back and played it, and in her recordings there's this very free rhythm that at first I was like, is she just sloppy? Like, what's going on? But then after listening to the birds, I realized that she's creating these effects. She's trying to have the natural flow of birds. There's also various other rhythmic things he does. I think Messiaen tries to capture the kind of swing of bells, the swing of church bells, because again, he was a very religious man, and he was always around churches. And bells have a natural kind of cacophony as they all swing and hit at different times. And I think in opening passages like this, where he's kind of expressing at one point the majesty of these mountains, and this is very dissonant music, but I'll explain why. You hear this kind of natural swing that I think happens with church bells. Swing. Just imagine these huge bells just swinging back and forth. And he does this with various other bells that he was very affected by. he also, so a way we can listen is by having this kind of context, by understanding what it is that we're listening to, what effects he's trying to create. And of course, the most important question, which I think I covered on the next slide, is why we have to listen. So we get that he's transcribing, we get how it works, but I think that when we listen to this music, we can hear a unique interpretation on birds. We can hear why Messiaen heard these things in this way. And it also allows us to go into nature, and I think, and hear it in a new way. Because I can tell you, I don't listen to birds the same anymore. Because I just kind of used to zone them out and hear them as the trills of Liszt. And now I'm hearing them for the nuance that they have. And Messiaen is also, as I said, he always tells stories. And there's so many in these pieces that I wish I could talk about, but I think my favorite is his wife's name was Yvonne Loriot, and Loriot is actually how you say Oriole in French. So this piece called Le Loriot obviously had a lot of significance to him. And you've heard how kind of discordant, how dissonant these harmonies are, but Messiaen, what he does is he slows down a bird call. He takes the Oriole call and slows it down very slow. You're right, it's extremely slow. And the call at its normal pitches is, but he harmonizes it. When I discovered this, it broke my heart. It was so beautiful that he did this. But he harmonizes this bird call with these harmonies. To think that he's doing these bird songs and he's trying to be accurate, but he's like, I love my wife so much that I have to give her this little shout out. I have to give her these beautiful chords amongst all this stuff. And he does so many just exciting things like that you'll be able to hear through the music and see projected. At one point, he starts to hear all these waves in the third piece. He hears all these waves in this bird singing, and to him, it reminds him of Javanese kind of drumming. And all of a sudden, the music literally breaks out in all these kind of crazy kind of Eastern rhythms and drum patterns as he's getting lost in the ocean and the calls, and it's like, you're crazy, but I love you. I just love Messiaen. I love the things that he does with music. And it's also to just inspire this feeling of composition and being involved in nature and being involved in the sounds that we hear. So the last part of this project was actually, there were two commissions. The first one was to a Toronto illustrator, Avery, who I think is here. She's here. Avery is over here. So what we actually decided to do is create a visual timeline for this music, so that as you listen to it, you can see the birds that are singing, you can see the mountains, you can see the oceans, and I had Avery kind of create these digital images that will be synced up with the performance. And so it creates a narrative, but we decided that because it's a 150th Canada, that we would also create a Canadian narrative, because Canada is known for its rich landscapes. We don't have to go to Paris to find mountains and oceans and coasts and forests. So we took Canadian images, Canadian natural landscapes, and put them with this music, and we kept the birds as they were. But just to create a Canadian narrative to this piece. The second part of the commission was an actual piece by Alondra, who's also here, over there. And so she composed this piece based on her kind of vision, I think, of birds, and it's a very evocative. We get back into this kind of, she combines them in this exciting way, where it's both literal in some of her gestures, but also very evocative of birds, very evocative of the feelings. So it's a really interesting kind of mix with this Messiaen, who's constantly very literal, and we get this really beautiful mix of literal and evocative. And that's basically what we did for this project. We have the two commissions, and I'm really excited to share this with you and for you to join in on the narrative. But I think I love to do this at the end of this presentation, is that the best way to understand this music and to understand the man behind it is to hear it from himself. So there's actually a video of Messiaen talking about this kind of wacky stuff, and so I'll let him tell you how. So I'll let him explain to you what this is all about, and then I'll come back out and set the show. So I hope you enjoy.
La seconde phrase, ce sont des batteries sur deux sons assez nets. Ensuite, dans le bras, comment tu es. Voici le râle de Genève. Ce rythme identique, très long, quand on observe la prairie. C'est lui qui fait. Et puis, des notes affectées qui se terminent par un torpoulos victorieux. Tio, 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 Alex. D'autres, ils sont lents, lunaires, lointains, on croirait que ça vient d'une autre planète et que l'oiseau est parti bien bien loin ailleurs. Et puis tout d'un coup, il est là et il y a une phrase formidable et très rapide pour